So I'm Patrícia Couto. I'm here with Clara, Brenck and José Pedro Bastos Neves to talk about our contribution to the book that José is organizing, Gender and Monetary Policy. And we are going to be exploring the exchange rate dynamic as a monetary policy tool, the effects on gender inequality and development. So this is going to be the structure of our presentation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the introduction and our motivation. Clara is going to walk us through the monetary policy, exchange rate, and developing economies. She's also going to talk about gender and labor market dynamics. And José Pedro is going to talk about the case studies we used to our analysis that is focused on Asian and Latin America countries. And he's also going to present our concluding remarks. I know this is not going to be anything new considering everything we spoke the whole morning, but just to walk you through our motivation, what brought us here in terms of our subject to this chapter. So as we know, macroeconomics models are trying to incorporate gender even more and more because there's a consensus among economists that gender is a key variable for economic growth. So understanding what is contributing to the persistent gender inequalities become the central of the discussion. And we are also facing, and I think with COVID, that became even more clear that depending on your gender, your race and zip code, the economic responses of COVID will be completely different. So I think this also brought the inequality to a different level of discussion. And of course, with the current scenario that we are seeing, with the high inflation scenario that it's the current economic discussion brought all the inequality and the inflation and monetary policy to this important discussion. But even with the importance of monetary tools to fight inflation, there is still few literature exploring that. The few ones are focusing in the United States, and the few ones that are looking at developing countries, they usually gather the countries due to the lack of data, and that can dismiss important regional economics dynamics. So the whole point that we wanted to do here, then looking at all this information, is to contribute to look at the monetary policy and how this affects gender inequality, but looking specifically at other monetary tools such as exchange rate, because it plays an important role in developing countries and it's little explored. So looking at the literature, the link with the exchange rate has considered two links actually. The inflation channel, where exchange rate impacts inflation, especially in developing countries, which Clara will be back to that later. And so the question is how inflation or other mechanisms to control inflation impacts gender. And what the literature has shown so far is that contractionary monetary policies, they have a differential impact in Blacks and women. And that happens because of their position in the labor market, because they are usually low-income individuals allocated to low-skilled jobs. And when we have contractionary monetary policies, the adverse effect, unemployment rate increases, they will be the first ones to be dismissed. So there's also the structural channel, which is the exchange rate as a key variable in driving structural change and development, which also affects the sectoral distribution of female labor. And the thing is, when we have changes in the exchange rate, especially in developing countries that they need to import capital goods, that will increase the cost of the production, and that will also affect the labor force, the female labor force participation. There's a lot to be explored, and I think we learned that during the presentations in the morning, but what we are going to focus here today is the structural change channel. We are going to look further in the labor market outcomes, and now Clara is going to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrícia. So yeah, as she said, like we're going to focus mainly on the structural change channel and on labor market outcomes. So I think as Melanie pointed out also yesterday, we have like the inflation channel, for example, a lot of the work is on where women are in the labor market and things like this. So that's why they're different. The impact on gender is different for example, contractual and monetary policy. So the first thing we thought was, well, let's look at female labor force participation around the world. We got 2016 because it was the latest available data for the countries that we wanted to get the majority, most countries we could. Then when we look at this graph, we see, well, looking here, this is GDP per capita. Low-income countries are much more, there's a lot of variability here. Okay, so we have countries with 80% of female labor force participation, while you have countries here with very low. When you go to higher GDP per capita, this looks like it's more converging or something like this. But there's a lot to be explored here in this part, which is where we decided to focus on. And then even when we separate this graph now on the global north and the global south, we see that even countries on the global north that are among these low-income countries, they do seem to be on this part together with the high GDP per capita countries. And it's actually in the global south that the variability is greater. So that's why we decided to focus on development. Again, as Patrícia said, there are few works looking at developing economies, so we want to also contribute to that point. Okay, so speaking of monetary policy in developing economies, I think it's almost impossible to talk about monetary policy in developing economies without including the exchange rate, for reasons Patrícia already said, and I'm going to explore a little bit more. So we just got this quote from this work. This is one of the few works that look at developing economies, exchange rates and gender. So targeting the real exchange rate as a monetary policy objective has received more attention recently, particularly in countries that have relied on export-oriented growth strategies. So that is why we decided also to focus on the exchange rate in this chapter. Okay, so what are the channels through that exchange rate affects developing economies and focusing on monetary policy and in development? So first, in the short run, we can consider exchange rate as an additional monetary policy too. First, it affects directly prices of exports and imports. So literally, by this exchange rates are price, and then it affects directly the price of imports and exports, which can then affect inflation, which we will also discuss a little bit in the medium run. So it can boost exports by improving price competitiveness, but it can also improve inflation or increase inflation if we think that countries import a lot of capital goods or intermediate goods for their production and things like this. It could also increase inflation. In addition to that, of course, it also affects the flow of international capital, so it can also have important consequences here. So just to summarize again, we have a high exchange rate pass-through in developing economies. Usually also, if you look at Latin America experience, the periods of hyperinflation were coincident with a devalued exchange rate. So that has a really high pass-throughs for Latin America, especially, but for developing economies in general. And it also can affect a lot the capital flow volatility. In the medium run, the development literature then focused on the role of exchange rate as promoting development in this sense. So first, inspired by Couto, we have the export-led growth and cumulative causation model where the real devaluations could then boost exports. And if the exports are, for example, the manufacturing sector that has increased returns to scale, this could then lead to growth and then productivity gains, and then come back on a virtual cycle of growth, with the productivity gains then helping again on competitiveness of exports, and then leading to a cycle of growth. And the structural change literature that also has to do with Calder, but also Prebisch and Hirschman also focus on the role of, for example, devaluing exchange rates as promoting exports. And again, focusing on the modern sector, which usually is the manufacturing sector, saying, well, if we devalue the exchange rate, then we can be competitive, international market, then we can increase the growth of the manufacturing sector in the economy, this would then lead to structural changes in the economy that would then promote development in a country that looks like this. However, this is not obvious, and we also have, if we take into account the distributional effects of exchange rates, then we come to authors that say, well, maybe devaluations can also be worse to the distribution of income. And as post-Keynesians, we know that if we worsen the distribution of income, we can then affect growth, and this could be on the other direction than expected. So, for example, this work find that higher real exchange rate levels actually generate higher saving rates, and also this occurs together with a fall in real wages and labor shares in national income, which then reflect the distribution of income against workers. So if you take that into account, maybe you can have an adverse effect of devaluation exchange rate on growth and on income distribution, which is something that we care. Okay. In addition to that, if you have that in foreign currency, again, the exchange rate can be seen as a price, so that can worsen the balance sheets, and you can also have wealth effects depending on who owns the bonds and those kind of things. So to summarize, well, yes, exchange rates, devaluations, for example, can generate structural change, but it's also like controversy about the overall effect. So we have the distribution of income that has to be taken into consideration, inflation, especially the role of exchange rate as a price of imports as well, and then the inequality. Then what we want to think is, well, how do we include gender in this discussion? Okay, so this discussion is there in the literature for a while, but how do we include gender in all that? Again, we're going to focus on the labor market because this is the thing that we first thought about. And then we want to, having all that literature in mind, see, well, where it's women usually allocated in developing economies. So what sectors are they allocated? And then what would be the effect of the exchange rate on those sectors? Are they tradable sectors? Are they not tradable sectors? Things like this. So for example, if we have a country where we have a lot of women allocated in the manufacturing sector, and if that country exports a lot of manufacturing goods, then indeed you could have the effect of exchange rates, boosting exports and improving female labor force participation, and then reducing a gender gap, for example. But if that's not the case, and then you only have women suffering with the inflation and inequality side, if they're not in the export sectors, then you can say, well, actually, this could not be beneficial and things like this. So this is where we want to, what we want to discuss here. So we do two things. First, an overall decomposition with the same countries that I showed the first Scatterplot. So we will decompose the female labor force participation into some indicators that I'm going to show in a few minutes to get deeper insights on the sector composition and basically on, especially on the female participation in manufacturing. And then José will present a more specific analysis looking at manufacturing sector, but then opening that manufacturing like textiles, computers and things like this. And then looking at a couple of countries, because of course, if you want to do something more in detail, that's what we want to do. So the data, we got employment by gender in economic activity in the International Labor Organization, and exports by economic activities and sectors in the Comtrade database. We merge those databases and then we get the data, our final data set, which shows 2016 because it was, again, the year that was closer to today and with more countries, with data for more countries available. For the specific exercise that José will present, we got some countries inspired on the work by Brownstein and Hines. It's one of the few work that look to developing economies and monetary policy and take into account exchange rates. So then we said, well, let's look at the countries that they use and then do our exercise. We had to multiply a little bit due to data availability. Those are not the countries. So they look in a couple more. And I think there's some here that they don't look at. So we look at India, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and then Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica to illustrate our argument. So starting here with this, our first variable, it's similar to the first one I presented. It's not exactly the same. This is the female share in the labor force. The other was the female labor force participation. So here, if we think that something that would be more equal would be 50-50%. So 50% of in total labor force, 50% would be women and 50% would be men. So then it would be in something close here, and that's actually what happens in high income countries. This is now separated by region. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so that's percent labor force who are women.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Of the total labor force, how many percent are women? You had a question? Yeah. And then again, we see that when we go here to low income countries, that varies a lot. You have countries around here, which are this green is Asia and Pacific, that have like 20% of the labor force being women, but you also have countries on Asia and Pacific that are up here, more than 50% of women. The pink is Africa. Then you see that there's a much more variability in this indicator when we look, especially here, below like 30,000 GDP per capita on current US dollars. So this is the decomposition that we make. Again, I'm going to focus on everything that has to do with manufacturing because of the literature I just mentioned. But in order to make this decomposition work, we have some other indicators here. So the first is the inverse of women's employment rate. The second is the inverse of the percentage of women employed in manufacturing. So of total women employed, how many, what's the percentage that is in manufacturing? This is the third one, is the one that I think is more important for our story, which is out of total employment in manufacturing, how many are women? Then the size of the manufacturing sector in terms of employment, and then finally just the employment rate just to close the decomposition, okay? So let's look at the first one here, the inverse of women's employment. Again, since this is the inverse, the closer to 1, the higher the employment rate. We see that for high income countries, that gets more concentrated here. But again, low income countries, you have women, high countries with really high unemployment for women, but also countries with very low unemployment for women, even very poor countries. This again, just I'm going to skip a little bit quick, but the inverse of the percentage of women who are employed in manufacturing. So out of total women employed, how many percent of them are in manufacturing? Again, since this is the inverse, the lower the indicator, the higher the percentage of women, of total employment of women that are employed in manufacturing. And then again, we see here some outliers in Africa, but also this is a little bit more concentrated here, maybe because of the scale of the outliers. But indeed, you have here also more variability in the low income side. And then when you go to the high income, it kind of stays a little bit more in a flat line. And this is the variable that we focus more, which is the female participation in total manufacturing. So if you have, for example, a country that has a big participation of women in manufacturing, and if that country exports manufacturing, then you could have the story of the development and structural change working and helping on the female gender gap in the labor market. But if you are in countries in this region, for example, you could have maybe the opposite of, for example, you have an increase in employment of men, and that increases bargaining power, and then you can have the whole gender dynamic actually the opposite direction than what would be desired. Again, just to show this is a lot of variability. There's a lot of stories here. It's very complicated to just aggregate all the developing countries. Well, we have developing economies, and then we need to do that to develop and that. There's a lot of story, we think, to tell looking at individual countries here. Just to finish then the decomposition, the participation of the manufacturing sector in total employment. This is also important. So again, of course, even if you have women in manufacturing, heavily in manufacturing, but if the manufacturing sector is very small, then maybe boosting manufacturing sector will not mean boosting female employment necessarily. We also see that as we increase per capita income, you have here maybe a movement like this, where you get some participation of manufacturing sector in total employment, but that's not as great as low income countries in a couple of cases. here, which can also make us think, well, maybe the modern sector today, it's not the manufacturing or things like this, and then we can also have a discussion about that. And finally, just to close, I'm not going to speak about this, but this is the employment rate. Again, variability on low-income countries. But again, this was just to close the decomposition. So just to summarize, we see a high volatility for low-income countries in those indicators. Again, the role of women on those economies is not the same, even if you take the group of developing economies or the group of economies with GDP per capita between 10,000, 20,000, that's not the same. We have a lot of variability. So it's, even though we know we have the lack of data problem, it's tough to aggregate them and talk to them as if we can get a general conclusion for all of them at the same time. Okay, so it's important, again, to look closely at those countries so we can better understand the role of the exchange rate in each one of them. The variable that we're looking here and that stands out in volatility is the female participation in manufacturing sector. And then what we want to ask ourselves is then, well, okay, but are those countries exporting manufacturing? Because then again, the exchange rate will come as with its role of boosting exports or not. And then this is what José represents now. Okay, so this is the questions we have. Is the participation of women in that sector greater than the average, which this is also important. So then we can see, well, if you have participation of women in the manufacturing sector that's relatively high, but other sectors are higher, then maybe you can have this imbalance as well with the role of the exchange rates. Now I pass to José.
Yeah, so I'm presenting actually the last empirical exercise we are thinking about doing for the chapter. And here we're actually looking at the connection between the exports and the female participation in the labor market, or specifically to the goods that are being exported, right? So this is the first table. Shows the first column is the tradable sectors, the second the non-tradable sectors, and we see that actually there are two different stories depending on whether the developing economy is in Asia or Latin America, right? So we can see that more or less the four countries, the women participation in the labor share, the female labor share in the tradable sectors in the Asian countries, they are really close to the total share of women in the labor market. So that means that, for instance, export-led growth that would tend to increase the tradable share of the economy would close the gender gap in these countries, whereas in the Latin America countries, this is not true. You see that particularly the tradable sectors, they employ less women relatively to the total than the overall economy. So, please. The total is women labor employees divided by total employment. Yeah.
Then how does the total for Indonesia of 38% get to be less than the percentage in both tradable and non-tradable?
Where in which Indonesia? Yeah, well, I have to take a look. Yeah, but that's a good. Yeah. Wow, amazing.
Right.
Okay. That's a good example of a good question for us. Your question, you come up with the answer yourself. Yeah. Well, but the idea here is more or less simple, right? So we have to be careful when we associate, for instance, growth, export-led growth with closing the gender gap in terms of employment. And finally, these two last slides. So just to explain a little bit for each country, here we have the 5 sectors that export the most. And the blue bars, they have the percentage of exports. So like for instance, in the first case, how other manufacturers is responsible for 15% of India's total export. The orange bar is the female female. My God, I'm getting wrong this. Female participation employment in the sector, and the gray line, the gray straight line, is the average for the country. So basically, the story here is that and these are the 5 sectors that export the most for each country. So the 5 sectors that are exporting the most in the Asian country, in these Asian countries, they employ they employ more than average. Like not all of them, but in India, the last 2, for instance, Indonesia, the 2 of them, Thailand, they have 3. So that means that boosting exports in these countries tend to close the gender gap. Whereas when you look in the Latin American countries, the average line is way up high. So that means that the sectors that are exporting more in these countries, they are actually contributing to increase the gender gap. And actually, this tells a cautionary tale about these associations between growth regimes, export-led growth in that case, and the consequences for gender employment. So just to some concluding remarks here, the first thing is that, especially when we talk about developing countries, we have to take into account exchange rate, and exchange rate has a particular consequence to the gender dynamics in the economy. And the second the second lesson here is that the fact is not obvious. It's going to depend on the specificity of the country, on the sectoral dynamics of that country, and we have to take a closer look to understand this. And just to mention some ideas we have moving forward. The first one is to explore the inflation. So basically, inflation is also related to exchange rate movements, as Clara told before, and this also has a consequence for gender. So these we still have to explore further. And finally, it would be very good to take into account the spillovers effect in different sectors. So of course, export-led growth does not limited itself to the export sector. So how can we understand the effects of on the overall economy? So thank you very much for your attention.